Stereo. There we are then.
Presenting Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Good evening, Chris. Hey, everybody. This music kind of dark in here today. Really dark. Alexa webcam. Maybe a little different. Okay. All right, we're doing it dark today. This is a scary episode, after all. Evening, Mona, Karen, Larry, Marita, Eric, Jerry, Martin, Lorena, Marie, Timothy, Susan.
Let's to a half-hour rhythm by Benny Goodman and his orchestra, the Raja Rhythm, playing for you from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago. Dodging a Divorcee, the first number. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Hey, Gina, Emily, Jennifer, Richard, Mary Jo, hey, Cindy. Seems darker in here today. I don't know why. Maybe my, oh yeah, my brightness is way down. That's all. Okay. Here I am. Mona, I like Spotted Cow. I really liked Enigma 23, and Raspberry Tart was pretty delicious as well. Hey, Lori, enjoy vacation. Hey, Karen, I'm debating doing the tour Sunday. I got enough people coming on the tour on Sunday that I'm gonna run it. I'm gonna, like, freeze a cooling towel or something. I've worked in hotter weather, and I've worked in places with less shade. Hey, Lenore. Hey, Natalie. I should have a drink going here, shouldn't I? No, I don't want that one. That's too much. Make sure Miles gets his contract in right there. Yeah, those are Miles' shoes. Hey, Amy. Hey, Natalie. Hey, everybody. Hey, Joanne. Hey, everybody. I got Benny too loud tonight, don't I? Yeah. Hey, Gina. Glad to hear you dodged the hurricane. Hey, Heather. Hey, Natalie. Hey, Kathleen. Still trying to get Wilbur Ward to me. All right. There is an address if you look on the Mysterious Chicago Facebook page. There is an address. That's the P.O. Box on Ogden Avenue. Hey, Ramona. Ramona, come closer. Shut softly your watery eyes. Hey, Paula. Hey, Eleanor. My family left up for Atlanta for the hurricane. In Hartford, hurricanes hardly happen. I just realized the two lens caps fit together. They're just so nice and neatly. Ah. Hey, Paula. Hey, Kimberly. Congrats, Betty. Hola, Kimberly. Hey, Geraldine. Karen, that would be nice. Yes, please. If everybody who bought it, that helps so much on that website. I hate bugging people for reviews. Hate it. As a consumer, I do not like being assigned homework. Hey, Betsy over on YouTube. Laura, yeah, we've done this one a couple of times before. But it's a neat one. So is that the old pink house with the brown door? It's the only house I know in Savannah, really. Cindy, glad to hear it. I got another one up today. Those of you, I'm going to put the links to both in here. There's Ghosts of Chicago, as you know, is back and better than ever before. And not to mention, while I'm doing this, I also say, you know, I think I got the rights back to some of my old YA novels. I am going to bring them back and put the proper titles on them and try to have a version that I'm more proud of than the versions that ended up getting published. So, Debbie Does Detention is now out here too. I'll put those in the chat. Well, hey, Johan, we're doing you next week, okay? Hey, Ben. Hey, Mary Rose.
Music by Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
I'm really glad to hear it. Hey, David. Hey, Gwendolyn. Now, Krista, that's an interesting question. Is did anybody actually do Johan? So I can't really tell. There's very little references that he ever makes that there was anything sexual going on in any of these relationships. Cindy, yeah, if they actually read this one, I know it showed up on a list of books that were being removed from libraries in one state. If any library in Iowa had it, it's gone now. Any school library, anyway. So yeah, just put the tagline, be gay, do crimes, quit church. That's kind of the message of the book. Yeah, it was called Sparks, the epic completely true blue almost holy quest of Debbie, with a cover that I had to write into the book. That was the same year the internet learned the term cultural appropriation. It wasn't my idea to have a blue Buddha statue on the cover. Hey, Beth. Hey, Lemond. Now, you know, nobody actually reads 12-year-old young adult novels, so it's not like I expect to have a whole lot of sales on this thing. But it's just nice to clear up the record, you know. Hey, Brandy. No, you know, I totally missed the supermoon. A 10-year-old young adult novels are in. I put one of my old ones back out under the name Debbie Does Detention. It was called Sparks, which... Well, I've read plenty of old YA myself, but there's not really a market for old YA books. They have a very short shelf life. Hey, everybody at Cassidy's. We're going to give Minnie one more second because I got started a little bit late. I just kind of realized what time it was. I got started a little bit late tonight. Why? Sheer laziness on my part. It sounds like it, but really it's just language. Thanks, people kicking in money already. That really does help. Especially, tomorrow's the end of the month. I need the money for the rent. Where's the money? Etc. Librarians call them challenged, but in the state of Iowa, they now are actually banned. Which is where the book takes place. And includes a minor subplot where they plot to plant a pressed ham on the window of the governor's mansion. Terry Branstad was governor at the time. He deserved it. COVID Kim deserves it even more. Hey, Phoenix. Hey, Dad. Hey, Miguel. If it's frozen for some people, I apologize. There's not a single thing I can do about that. Banned in Florida? Probably, if anybody knows about it in Florida. The thing is, this was not a popular book. It won some awards, but that isn't enough that anybody actually takes notice of you. Because, look, Play Me Backwards is way worse than most of the books that are getting banned. This one is way worse than a lot of the ones that are getting banned. And everybody knows it has nothing to do with the content. These kids have unlimited access to porn, and everybody knows it. Hey, Stephanie, we just saw Miles a minute ago. Miles, there goes Priya. And Miles is... He's here. Behind the chair right now, but he's here. There he is. But alright. Tons of branches in Spanish moss. That's a shame. Those are a mess. Oh, I was supposed to have it up on this the whole time. I come prepared, I wasn't a Boy Scout, I was a Cub Scout. But I graduated from that, which makes me a Boy Scout, and yet I did not come and be prepared. What if I'm out for an adventure of a new and different kind and come across a Girl Scout who is similarly inclined? I will, in fact, be nervous, be flustered, be scared. But alright, everybody, so welcome along. I'm just going to open this up for a second. The tour begins at 8 p.m. CST. We started a little bit late tonight because I got started a little bit late tonight. But all right, welcome along. I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago Tours. Been a tour guide and a historian here in Chicago for many years now, going on 20 of them. I've been saying that this whole time as we've been rounding up for a while. Author of such books as Mysterious Chicago, the book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Murder Maps USA, Graceland Cemetery, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets, and just re-released Ghosts of Chicago. Brand new 10th anniversary edition is now on Amazon, both for Kindle and in print. Thanks to everybody who has ordered it so far. I was really pleasantly surprised by how many people ordered a copy of this one. Very pleasantly surprised. So thanks a lot for joining me. Today we are actually tied into this because I wrote some of these stories into the new edition. They weren't, I didn't know about the headless ghost in Winnetka. And really, this is the Ghosts of Chicago. The suburban stuff is really out of my jurisdiction, but I can't resist a headless ghost. So over the course of tonight, we are going to tell some stories about Ghostlore from the North Shore. And there was a time when the North Shore was thought of as a very, very haunted area, especially along Sheridan Road. There are a couple of these articles like this. One from 1896, The Mysteries of Sheridan Road. And one from a few years later. Both the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean covered this one. This one is from, 6 years later, 1902, talking about all the ghost stories that are associated alongside or within shouting distance of Sheridan Road going up through the North Shore suburbs. Evanston, Wilmette, Highland Park, Highwood, Winnetka, all of those places. You know what I mean. The places that you go to if you keep on driving past Who's Your Mama Pie, past Calvary Cemetery, etc. So to start with, we're going to start right on the very edge. Now, really, for the most part, Howard Avenue is the dividing line between Chicago and Evanston. There were a lot of attempts to absorb Evanston back in the day. At one point, people thought it was a given that Chicago would eventually absorb Evanston. And really, it's kind of remarkable we didn't absorb more than we did. I mean, of the cities that are close to Chicago in population, Los Angeles and Houston. Los Angeles is a bit bigger. Houston is approaching that space. But Chicago is something like 200 square miles. Los Angeles is something like 400 square miles. Houston is over 600 square miles. Like, if we included, if we covered as much ground as Houston, we'd probably include Milwaukee in the Chicago metro area. Really, we kind of do anyway. It's one of my favorite Chicago neighborhoods, Milwaukee. But that would take the North Shore up even further. Then we could absorb all the Wisconsin ghost stories, too. I'm sure there must be some of those. But there's just the one part that we did manage to absorb of Evanston is the patch of land between Howard Avenue and Calvary Cemetery. It's a little neighborhood called Germania, and we did actually absorb that. So Calvary is really the dividing line, Calvary Cemetery, right here along the lake. And this little stretch of Lakeshore Drive, or Sheridan Road by the time you get up here, is said to be haunted by a ghost known as Seaweed Charlie, who is said to be a guy covered in seaweed, and usually either a flight suit or a long coat, who was said to walk out of the lake, climb up over these rocks, and then crawl into the cemetery, sometimes floating right through the gates if they don't happen to be open, as they are right here. This was a little more popular, I think, back in the 1960s and 1970s. Now, the best guess anybody has come up with is that perhaps it is the ghost of a guy named Laverne Neighbors, who was a test pilot out of the Glenview Naval Air Base, who crashed his FH-1 Phantom into the lake out near Northwestern University. Would have been just a little ways north of this. But several people crowded onto the shore after the plane went down. They were able to see him crawl out onto the wings and wave for help, but he did not survive. Did not recover. But not only did he die, he's presumed to be the ghost, but that kind of leaves out the fact that several other people drowned while trying to salvage his plane in the days that followed. But his body was finally recovered about a month later. He's not actually buried in Calvary Cemetery, which would make this a much better ghost story. One question that has to come up with, though, is if it was Laverne Neighbors, why do we call it Seaweed Charlie? That's because the names we assign to these ghosts when we don't know specifically who it is really have nothing to do with real life, like Resurrection Mary. I don't know of a single good first-hand account where that ghost actually says what her name is, at least prior to long after the story became famous. We just call it Resurrection Mary because it's got a better ring to it than like Resurrection Ethel. Like, what if we called this Seaweed Laverne? It just doesn't have the same ring to it, you know. And really, you know, how well something works as a story, how well it fits into folklore, that has really much more to do with whether a ghost story survives than whether the ghost actually shows up or whether anybody actually sees it. There are any numbers of things like this. I don't know if I can tell you a single first-hand account of Seaweed Charlie. I don't know of anybody who actually told me they nearly drove off the road or anything. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but it's one of those ghosts that's well known, but there's not a lot of first-hand accounts. It's really kind of notorious within Ghostlore. Finding a first-hand account of these is notoriously difficult. But all right. We're going to move up a little further north. We come to Wilmette. We just have to cover for a second here. So right around in here, there was a house that was still standing up until the 1990s. According to my calculations, that house would have been right up about where a driveway is now. There's been some new construction here lately. But up until the 1990s, there was a house standing here that looked like this, which would have been the other H.H. Holmes castle. H.H. Holmes, of course, is the Devil in the White City guy, often advertised as America's first known serial killer and said to have built a castle down on the south side that was full of hidden rooms, secret chambers, etc. Now, about 1893, he built this house up in Wilmette for his wife, his daughter, and his mother-in-law. Presumably his father-in-law too, though I don't really get the impression that his mother-in-law and father-in-law were particularly close as a couple. This was built by the Weber and Laban Brick Company, who never did get paid, and was officially owned on paper by one of Holmes's girlfriends, who disappeared the same summer that it was built. This led to a lot of trouble. After Holmes was executed, they had to kick his wife, daughter, and mother-in-law out of the place. And they had to go through some court records to do that. But officially, the owner of it was a woman who had now disappeared. The building company had never been paid for it. It was announced at the time that the Wilmette House had just as many secret passages and things as the place down on the south side. Probably this was not true. People said that they saw Murda, his wife, out burying stuff in the backyard and assumed the worst. He was just burying old garbage just like anybody else would. Would they? We'll just say yes. While we're talking about Holmes stuff on the north side, we will also cover just briefly the body dump. This is what it looked like back when I was taking ghost tour groups out here. Really just kind of an empty field. Then there was this curved garage structure you can see. It would have been right about where Holmes had a one-story glass bending factory. That's officially it was a glass bending factory, though nobody ever saw him actually bending any glass there. By the time the cops found that all that was really there was the wreck of a very long furnace and some of Holmes' paperwork. So we like to joke, at least, that this may have been where he was taking care of bodies. Probably not. It would have been kind of unwieldy to get there. But it was still very spooky and did turn out to be fairly haunted, too. We started taking people here on ghost tours just as a historical curiosity. At the time, we were going to the Virgin Mary Salt Stain quite a bit, and we were going to the Liars Club quite a bit. And this happened to be right in between them. I remember Troy Taylor sent me the assignment. He sent this article, Another Castle Found. Figure out where this is. And it took me a while, but I was able to find it was on Sobieski Street. They didn't give precise directions in there. I had to dig up the original article, not the excerpt that he had sent over. Turned out it was this little stretch of road right about where this is now. When we got there, for one thing, it's now a stretch of Sealy Avenue. It used to be called Sobieski Street. But when we got there, there was a giant billboard for Sobieski vodka, or Sobieski, I suppose it's pronounced. Also, there was this tree there that was oozing some kind of red gunk. Probably just a result of iron oxide in the soil from when the area was a garbage dump. But when you go to the body dump and see a black branch with blood that keeps dripping, that's pretty spooky. We started coming here just as a historical curiosity, but also started getting pictures like this one with this mysterious shadowy figure. Or this one with this other mysterious shadowy figure. Or this one with this mysterious shadowy figure. Lots of weird pictures at this place. This is also the only time I thought that I actually saw a ghost on the tour. It's like this woman in a black dress walking along in front of the bus, opened the door to make fun of her, and she was just gone. It was also the night we were backing the bus up and thought that we hit a ghost. We thought we hit a person. It was snowy, the windows were fogged up, we hit something. And somebody said there was a woman back there, so I ran out, just hightailed it out there, hoping we had hit a car. But there was nothing out there. There was no footprints in the fresh snow, which on the balance is the way I wanted it to be. If I'm going to hit something with the bus, I'd really prefer that it be somebody who was already dead and has been since about the 1890s. So this is right near the intersection of Damon Elston and Fullerton. It has all been rebuilt now. There's condos right here where that serial killer van is over on the left, because of course there is. But we're going to move back to Wilmette a little bit. There was a house right near Holmes's, just down the block from Holmes's. And I've had a difficult time triangulating exactly where this one was, as it had to be rebuilt a bit. That's right, Casey. Red gunk and mysterious shadowy figures are never explainable. No, Bob, the tree is no longer there. They tore the tree down. So I'm glad I documented it a bit. But down here on Lake Avenue was the home of Mrs. Crone, Mrs. Mary Crone. And this is a murder that Holmes was actually accused of briefly. But there was a house right about here. I couldn't figure out if this was the original. It's very difficult to tell. I don't think it was. The house didn't have a specific address. This is back in the 1890s when the address of a place in Wilmette would be like across from the depot above the paint store. And a lot of these places were so rural that you would just deliver general delivery to get your mail. But there was a house, the Crone house looked like this. This does look about right if they've done some refinishing and some reworking, as you tend to do over the course of 130 years. But inside of this place back in 1893, shortly after Holmes moved into the area, now he didn't spend a lot of time there, but he had the house here. A guy named Frank Wheeler came into the house. His mother-in-law lived here. Found a burglar in the house. His version of the story was he saw a burglar, so he attacked. You know how they handle burglars up on the North Shore. But in it lived Mary Crone. He shot the burglar to death, then ran along and saw his mother-in-law, Mrs. Crone, lying in a pool of blood. He looked over the burglar, saw there were bite marks on the guy's hand that showed evidence of a struggle. Then he realized there were two other burglars. So he chased them off, but when he came back, he saw that the house was on fire. So this is a diagram that was published in the paper at the time. Mrs. Wheeler's room was over. Mr. Wheeler's room was here. His mother-in-law was across the hall. You can see her body lying there in a pool of blood. So this was a mystery that was never solved. Personally, I find it, we have to kind of take his word for it. All they ever found were a couple of charred bones. So we really just have to take Mr. Wheeler's word for it that there was a burglar present, or not let alone two other burglars who were chased away. Difficult style. A couple of years after this, when the Holmes castle was under investigation, people were wondering, hey, he was a neighbor. Could he have done that? Inspector Fitzpatrick said, no, Holmes was a scientific killer. He never would have dreamed of killing somebody of high violence. You might just as well accuse him of the Jack the Ripper horrors in London as accuse him of the Crone murder. Having no idea that 130 years on, people would be accusing Holmes of the Ripper murders. In fact, tomorrow on the Patreon, a quick plug for the Patreon down below, I'll be publishing the simplest proof that Holmes could not have been Jack the Ripper. Just a teaser for you. The whole thing just sounds fishy to me. We're going to move a little bit through Evanston. Right about here, about as near as I can figure, in the fall of 1896, newspapers all over the country reported that a skeleton had been unearthed right here. And not only had they found a skeleton, it would have been all undeveloped at the time, they said a woman named Mrs. Parker had been having dreams about this space. And after one of the dreams, she talked her husband into digging there, and he didn't find anything. But then she kept having more and more dreams until he dug again and started finding bones. And this was only a few months after H.H. Holmes was hanged, so people were, of course, thinking, could these have been more Holmes victims? And this spread into papers all over the place. It didn't make nearly as much news in Chicago. Like, the Tribune and the Inter-Ocean never even mentioned the story. It was covered mostly in the Daily Record, which was the morning version of the Chicago Daily News, which came out in the evening. Now, when I dug up the local versions of it from the Record, the story differed a little bit from the version that spread around. This is why you'll always want to go back to the source. In their version, the woman had been walking along and had a premonition about the spot. It wasn't in dreams, it was just a presentiment as she walked past the place. And it was just the once the husband dug and found some bones, immediately reported to the police. The police shortly thereafter went to get the reporters and announced that we found a pit full of bones, including a human skull. So this went around the press for a while until the police admitted what had really happened. They had had some kind of a beef with the reporter in question, so before calling him, they went to the medical school and borrowed a skull to toss into what they already knew was just the bones of a dead horse. Really, they just wanted to make the reporter look bad. The skull was said to have gone to a fraternity house at Northwestern. I don't know if they still have it. I'd love to find out if they did. But really, this was just horse bones. The interesting thing is people kept on telling this story of the woman who dreamed about a grave and found a skeleton buried nearby. Long after it had been established that, despite the initial thing of finding bones in a hole, this is kind of in the border between Evanston and Wilmette. They also found they were just a horse. How Detective White got even. This is kind of a thing, we call it the Roswell syndrome, is that a lot of times a thing will hit the news and then it'll get explained away. And then people will forget about it, and then the kind of story will kind of seep back into the public consciousness and have grown quite a bit. Not only will for people have forgotten that it had been explained away, also it will have grown and grown and grown. We see this a lot, in fact, with the H.H. Holmes story. Most of the H.H. Holmes story was either debunked or wasn't part of the story yet in 1895. Then it kind of went underground for about 40 years, and when it came back, suddenly there were all these more things to it, about like torture chambers in the basement. etc. As a horse is a horse, of course. Of course. Some very neat places up here. This is Sheridan near Ashland. September 1903, this road led to a club. And one night in the club, person after person came into the club and said the darndest thing just happened. They had just been coming up along Sheridan and saw a busted carriage by the side of the road. So they went to help this carriage, and inside they saw a body wrapped in a shroud. It appeared to be a woman's body, a dead body. But the thing is, people would go over and help this carriage get back on the road, and then the next person would see the same thing. Newspapers contacted every funeral home in town trying to figure out what was going on, but there's no reports of a busted carriage on Sheridan Road that night. Now, this is the kind of thing, it sounds like the kind of story where they should have gotten handsomely rewarded for helping the dead woman get transported to her grave. This is a Grateful Dead story. This is the kind of stories from which the band took their name. This is the kind of thing where they should have been handsomely rewarded for, spending their last penny. Except that they weren't spending their last penny. These were guys going to a wealthy man's club. But they did stop to help the carriage along the way. The thing is, it just kept on happening over and over and over again. And this, believe it or not, this was front page news the next day. This is a clip from the front page of the Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean. Now, within the Wilmette-Winnetka area, there's a little pocket community, a little pocket town called Kenilworth. This is actually where the McClintocks lived. This is the people that we've been talking about on the stories the last few days about the fatal fortune of the Hicklings and McClintock fortunes, which is also the topic of the week over on the Patreon, and will be next week as well because it's such a long and twisting story. I'd go broadcast from the house. I'm going to do it one of these days, but just warning ahead of time, every time we go to Kenilworth, or really anywhere in the North Shore, especially above Evanston, we have a lot of trouble with broadcasting. For some reason, the cell phone signal just isn't that great up there. But this is the Kenilworth Railroad Station, where there's an early story that's in both of those old Sheridan Road Ghost Stories articles, saying that one day out here, a guy named William Lamport, an early prominent resident, poisoned himself, and in his death throes came out to around here and started tearing up the grass. The story was that no grass would grow there now. But I don't know what the exact spot would be. There's not any way to determine that, but it looks probably like grass is growing there now unless they've paved over it. This is one thing, it was a story that went around a lot, but I couldn't find any documentation of William Lamport's death. It's the kind of thing that would normally make the news. One other thing in Kenilworth is in the middle of this churchyard is one solitary grave. Who gets a churchyard all to themselves? Who is so honored a person that they get the whole churchyard for just their grave? It would be Eugene Field and his wife Julia. Eugene Field is a poet best known now for Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. He was known as the poet of childhood, hugely popular in his day, kind of fallen out of favor in recent years, definitely not as well known, though there are schools named after him around here. But we here at Mysterious Chicago, who go on the After Hours tour, also know that Eugene Field wrote a very charming poem called On Julia Unlacing, which is all about how much he loves his wife's farts. And one called Socratic Love that is listed by the Oxford English Dictionary as the first use of the word poop in both its modern noun and verb form. It's a really gross poem overall. But you can write really gross poems. You can write really dirty poems about farts and really kind of touching poems about farts. Or be as gassy as Julia apparently was. And still get a churchyard all to yourself. I think that's just magnificent personally. But we'll move a little bit further. There's a question about why was the Home Alone house referenced. That movie all takes place on the North Shore. And in fact, the territory this next ghost is said to haunt, would be right where the Home Alone house is now. Why, it could have been the ghost instead of Old Man Marley who saves Kevin's butt. And incidentally, the fiance from the McClintock story ended up living in Old Man Marley's house. Yes, Molly Bean, the more you fart, the better you feel. So let's have beans at every meal. over here along the shore. This used to be known as Tower Park. There's a lighthouse now that is now mistaken for the tower that is at the name of the end of the woods. Really, there used to be a very large tower that stood here, the Winnetka Tower. It was kind of a landmark for it. But long about 1881, some kids were playing on the beach and found a human head. Now, by the time anybody came around to look at it, the thing had been washed out to sea. But a couple of months later, a body was found, a headless body, immaculately dressed in fine German clothing, but missing its head. It was a very clean cut, probably made after death, and when you cut somebody's head off after death, it is to hide the identity, usually. Very clean cut. So they hastily buried this body right in the town square, which would have been at the time right where Hubbard's Woods is, where they called it at the time. And now there's a Hubbard Wood Park, presumably in the same space. The body was just buried right about here. Even though with no real investigation, nobody even wanted to dig through the pockets or take the clothes off because the thing smelled so incredibly bad. This is what the tower looked like back then. Scroll up there a little bit. Where the body was found. This prompted a letter to the editor. The people are very inhuman or indisposed about this region. About 2 months ago, a man's head was discovered in the lake, and no one thought enough of the matter to get the head or hold a coroner's inquest or decently bury it. So there was enough of a backlash here that they had the body disinterred, got the clothing off of it, then had it reburied. They matched it up with the skull that probably came from a medical cadaver that had been found down on the south side. They held them up together and said, yep, that's a match, and had it sent out to where Dunning is now to be buried, even though it was almost certainly the wrong head. So if you go by the actual numbers, the per capita rate of being decapitated and buried in the wrong head, the per capita decapitations in Winnetka would have been 200 per 100,000 people. That's very high. That's about 3 times the murder rate in New Orleans, which is about 3 times the murder rate here in Chicago. But thereafter, almost inevitably, after all of this, there was said to be a headless ghost that wandered between its gravesite and the old tower area. Later, they said that the body had been identified as a guy named Ignaz Hoff, who was a mayor of a small town in Germany. There were a couple of other suggestions, though. I don't think the ID could have possibly been certain. But this was said to be where the thing walks, and right in between that would have been the Home Alone house. Now, this is just the beginning of Winnetka, too. Also, right around over here was Annie Russell. Now, Annie Russell, every ghost article about Sheridan Road said the ghost of Annie Russell was the ghost of a young woman who was the belle of the north suburbs, though she never made the news under that name while she was alive. But the story went, if in fact she existed, the story went that she had many suitors, but there was only one man that she truly wanted. And when he rejected her, she walked down to the pier and threw herself into Lake Michigan. And since then, when lovers would walk along the beach, they would see her ghostly form walking up and down the pier, wringing her hands. That's the nice touch of it, too, the wringing her hands part. No luck finding any historical data about this, but both of the articles about it give her the same name, which is something. They never give a date, though, as to when this was supposed to have happened. Of course, there aren't very many. There weren't very many people in Winnetka at the time, so it would have been kind of hard not to be the belle of the North Shore if you lived there. This is also along this part of the shore. Kids used to play with the wreckage of the Lady Elgin. The Lady Elgin was a ship that in 1860 was sailing from Milwaukee to Chicago. So supposedly, I looked this up one time. The story was that they were going to hear Stephen Douglas give a speech. I looked it up and I remember finding it wasn't quite right. But there were storm clouds and bad visibility. The Lady Elgin collided with another ship and sank within half an hour. Most of the survivors' body and debris were swept down to Winnetka, though some ended up clear out on the south side. About 300 people were killed. And most of them were buried in what is now a missing cemetery up in Highwood. This is some wreck of the Lady Elgin that kids were still playing on years and years later. Highwood is a little bit north of Highland Park. Now, as of 1899, it was said that gravesite was so badly wrecked and neglected and overrun by cows that it was only still marked by a couple of wooden stakes, and nobody even seemed to remember quite where it was anymore. 27 unidentified bodies were said to have been buried at Rose Hill Cemetery. Rose Hill tells me they know where the plot is now, but they don't think anybody was actually buried there. Now, as buildings started going up near the space where the bodies were buried, there were a lot of ghost stories. In particular, there was a ghostly woman in a black dress who had appeared dripping wet, wearing a gold necklace and waving her arms like she was trying to get people away from the place. A witness by the name of Henry Mowers, who was on the beach the day of the wreck, said that days afterwards, a body of a woman in black had washed ashore in Winnetka, wave-tossed and beach-beaten, but you could tell that she was beautiful, wearing a gold chain and rings. They locked the body into a nearby building until officials could arrive, but when the officials did, they appear to have stolen her necklace, which made it harder and harder to identify her. So she was buried without that and unidentified. This is about where it would have been. People have tried to figure out where this is. Apparently, like the Highwood Historical Society had an article saying that they'd found it, but then their website went down, and nobody seems to know quite where it is anymore. So, missing cemetery, missing graves all over the place for the Lady Elgin. That's like a breeding ground for ghost stories. But while we're in Winnetka, we're not done with Winnetka murders yet. Winnetka would have had an off-the-charts murder per capita rate. People would refer to it as the murder town, but not because of the high rate of them there, but because of one specific murder that really haunted the news. It would have been right around here, in a house that was later moved. But just beyond the train tracks, in 1884, was the home of the Wilsons. It had been just up here a little ways. Near as I could figure. Now, this was the house of James and Clarissa Wilson. Now, James was a local official, a businessman, and a painter. His wife, Clarissa, quite a bit older than he was a political junkie. Now, one of my favorite stories about her is one day somebody brought her a present wrapped up in a copy of the Chicago Times, and she threw the whole present in the fire because she hated the Chicago Times so much, which is awesome. The Chicago Times was this nasty copperhead paper. But by this time, in 1884, she had kind of lost her mind. There were stories about her hoarding eggs because she thought they were made of gold. And James, her husband, would go to Chicago once a week to buy supplies, and a neighbor would come in to visit Mary. Now, one night before this, he went to Mr. McKeague, the butcher, and said, "I've got an old friend coming over that I haven't seen in years. I want a really good piece of meat, and I want some more meat delivered tomorrow." So he made that arrangement, bought some meat. The next morning, the neighbor came by, as she always did, and found that the doors were all still locked. That was very unusual. So she went around to a window, managed to get herself inside of the place, and there inside she found James Wilson, lying beaten and shot behind the stove in a pool of blood. This is apparently an actual picture of the crime scene. He would have been like shoved down behind the stove there. And upstairs as well, in Mrs. Wilson's room, he found that Mrs. Wilson had been killed with her late son's Civil War sword. And one of the early books writing about this says this is a direct legacy of 1619. In 1619, the first enslaved people were brought here. Then we had the Civil War to free them, and now that Civil War sword had been used as a weapon of murder. It's kind of strange, honestly, because I don't think the murder was necessarily dependent on the presence of the sword, but we'll let it go anyway. Now, nobody seems to have a motive for any of this, except that they did believe that Mr. McKeague owed the Wilsons some money. Best theory anybody could come up with is that he had brutally murdered them because he owed them a few bucks. Or possibly because, well, we didn't really understand the concept of a serial killer back then, that you didn't necessarily need a motive. The motive could just be the voice in your head. Now, at the time, I think nowadays they could have figured it out. There were some buttons and some hair found at the scene that they just couldn't prove did belong to McKeague. So after a long trial, they determined the evidence against him was not sufficient. He was acquitted of the murder. The murder was never officially solved, but nothing that they ever really came up with either could explain this level of brutality from him. A couple of years later, he left the area and was shot to death in a fight over a card game in a place called Church's Ferry, North Dakota. Which sounds like, Church's Ferry, North Dakota sounds like the kind of town that would only exist because you needed some place for people to get murdered in a card game after fleeing away after having been accused for murders. Only thing I can think of. Right about in the same place, is the Henry Lloyd House. Now, this was occupied by a journalist back in the day whose son was one of the founders of the Communist Labor Party in the United States, Henry Lloyd. 1855, it was occupied by a ghostly little old lady who went all over the place and didn't really bug them very much. After the Lloyds moved the house across the street, she still showed up, but not as much. And this is a tricky one, because what old lady could have died in this place by 1855? There aren't very many of them. But all right, everybody, so those are some of the ghost stories of the North Shore, as seen in the new book, the 10th anniversary edition of The Ghosts of Chicago, which I'll now post the link one more time over in here. There we go. And pop back over to here. And all right, so upcoming next Thursday night, I just realized it's been like a year since I did the Johann Hawk tour. Even I've done a ton more research since then, so it's going to be, some of it's kind of out of my head at this point, as I kind of stopped when I got too busy with this New York Cemetery book. But I got quite a lot of stuff on Johann Hawk since the last time this was done. Next, in person, about the only one I'm planning for the next few weeks, September 3rd, 11 a.m. at Graceland Cemetery, one of your last opportunities for an in-person tour until things get haywire in October. Be there or be square. The Mystericon events that have not already sold out will go on sale to the general public, not just people in the Mysterious Chicago Regulars and Miles fan club page, later this week, early next week. I think the September 5th is the date. The bus tours, there's only a couple of seats left on the late bus tour. The first one is sold out. I hope to do another one later on. We shall see. Tomorrow is Find a Grave Friday, followed by the Whiskey and a Cookie on the Patty Vasquez show page. That is at 7 o'clock. Morning mini tours continue every day at 10 o'clock. So everybody, thank you very much. I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago. We'll pop that up here and put the Benny Goodman back on. Thanks, everybody. Yep, I paused on the Hawk book because I've just had trouble finding a publisher for it. Now I'm questioning, am I better off just doing it myself anyway? It's a lot harder to do the promotion, but they may or may not actually promote it anyway. And then I'm saddled with making like 60 cents a book. Good night, Claudel. Have a good night to you, too. Yep, everybody here is now 40 minutes smarter. Well, I might make a little bit more if I do it myself, but it's harder to get it reviewed in the press. It's harder to get publicity for it. There's a prestige aspect to it. But then again, they do make a lot more per copy when I put stuff out for myself. With nonfiction, it's not like they're going to really do much editing anyway. Thanks, everybody. Venmo's a good one to hit tonight. So I've been building up on Venmo for a bit. Haven't spent any what I get on Venmo. I'm pretty close to being able to pay my rent on Venmo, as I do every so often. Books on tape. Now that's another trick. Thanks, Ava. Oh yeah, I know I could count on a couple hundred sales from the Mysterians on a Johann Hawk book. But where else could I go? Who else could I get? It might be worth finding out. Yeah, Molly, I feel like I have an okay voice for that kind of thing. I don't know why they've never even asked me about when they've done an audiobook of my stuff. Yeah, everybody who's bought either this one or Sparks, please, I hate to bug people about reviews on Amazon, I really do. But they're bizarrely important on there. I could drop links in the Forgotten Chicago group. Well, so people can make racist comments. That's all anybody ever does on that site. Kathy Carey. I've got enough data for a Johann Hawk book anyway, so. All right, Cindy. Sobieski, why don't you record my own audiobook? It's a lot of effort for no money up front, is the thing. And then I gotta distribute, etc. That's a lot of work, recording a whole audiobook. Molly will do. Ronnie is in New York right now. Got to meet with her publisher and everything. Got to go to some book events. Hey, everybody, look who's here. It's Priya. Priya Cat. You want to get picked up, Priya? You do not. She loves to crawl on people. She does not like to get picked up very much. Miles popped in a little bit earlier, but he's been sitting on the suitcase this whole time. If you see that suitcase that I forgot to clear out of the way beforehand. Thank you, Cindy. Lily is still here, yeah. Lily spends most of her time in Ronnie's office. Will they be at the Chicago Literary Fest this year? Not that I've heard of. The kind of stuff you do to self-promote a book is rarely that effective. I mean, see the afterword of the new edition of Debbie Does Detention for some really bitter tea getting spilled. My experiences in publishing were rarely good, but that was one book that I actually wished I hadn't sold. Gail, I agree. I think it's, I listened to somebody else narrating a Bill Bryson book and they just couldn't do it. Yeah, in both of the cases, the H.H. Holmes book and Mysterious Chicago, the book about audiobooks, I never heard from the company. They never talked to me once about who would actually do the narration. Now, Gina, I can see your comment. Have a good night. John has been instructed to read The Smart Aleck's Guide to American History. All right. The reason that one is still in print. That one and I Kissed a Zombie and I Liked It, I think they're probably not going to give me back the rights on just now. I'm trying to find who to talk to at Random House. There were a couple of books I was supposed to get the rights back on in 2014. And they kept saying, oh, sorry, we keep forgetting to send the contract. Well, Molly is publishing. Even audiobook publishing, eh. So back in 2016, I asked if they would do, if they wanted an updated edition. They were like, nah. But if the rights ever come back, maybe I'll do an updated edition and say exactly what I really think. I was surprised they let me get away with as much Bush bashing as I did in it. It wasn't even that much. But it came out, it was being finished up right when the housing market tanked. You can't blame him entirely for that.
Benny Goodman's orchestra and the King Porter's Stomp.
You instructed this, not his teacher. Okay. That makes more sense. But that book's still chugging along. I still make, enough to get dinner a couple times a year out of that. I don't know how, but... Bottoms up, Laura. Apple caramel wine. I saw some maple applesauce the other day. I think maybe it was the Cheese Castle. Oh yes, everybody stay spooky. Lori, that means you. Phoenix, of course, the Cheese Castle. You can't go through Kenosha without stopping at the Mars Cheese Castle. They also have applesauce. And other forms of sauce. And beer. Where are we going tomorrow? Find a Grave Friday. That's all I know. I haven't found out anything else. Taking my books camping. Okay, well, if you attacked by a bear, do not attempt to use any advice in any of my books. It's like running a zigzag pattern. Good night, Susan. All right, the Graceland tour for this weekend is starting to fill up. Not fill up, but it's about halfway there. This is about more than I expected this weekend. Thank you, Molly. I should get back to adulting as well, so everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago Tours. I will see you all in the morning for Find a Grave Friday. Thanks again to everybody who has ordered the new copies of the new books. Everybody who's bought tickets already ahead of time for Mystericon stuff coming up, especially the boat tours. I got a lot of tickets to sell for those boat tours. Stresses me out every year. I'm fine. But all right, everybody, thanks a lot for joining me. I will see you all tomorrow morning for Find a Grave Friday. And until then, stay safe and stay strong. And of course, be like the ghost in tonight's episode and stay spooky.